we want all the time in the world to have them speak. So we're going to start with just introducing Michelle Yancey so she could say a couple words. I'm going to try to find you, Michelle. I think you're on here. If you can unmute yourself and
I'm
say,
unmuted. Hi.
yes, perfect.
I am unmuted. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to welcome you all today. And I want to thank the team who worked so hard to put this event together, and for all of our panelists and guests who are joining us. I'm Michelle Yancey. I'm Executive Director of Good Shepherd Services. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Just very briefly, I want to share with you that, we at Good Shepherd Services have been on a very serious journey of becoming an anti-racism racist organization, and a multicultural organization for the past 4 years. We are committed to this work, and one element of that work is creating a culture of belonging. What we're doing here today is very central and a very big part of that culture building and welcoming of all, internally at Good Shepherd and our colleagues and friends. We also want to actively, as hard as it is, wrestle together to create spaces to have challenging conversations. That also is an important part of what we're doing here today. And this is really part of a series of public panel conversations that we have hosted, that we've taken part in throughout the year. And we welcome all of you to join us in being part of this journey and part of the conversation that we're going to have here today. Thanks all for joining. And Selena, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to remove the spotlight. I know it gets awkward. I'm so sorry. Our panelists are about to be super spotlighted soon, but I'm going to move us into something at GSS that we hold sacred, which is our land acknowledgement. Can everyone see our land acknowledgement on the screen? Awesome. So I'm going to invite you all to take a deep breath as I read this acknowledgement. We live on the original homeland of the Lenape-Hoking. Lenape-Hoking includes today the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Connecticut. Due to colonization, the Lenape people continue today as a diaspora, including 2 federally recognized nations in Oklahoma, 1 in Wisconsin, and 2 in Ontario, Canada. We recognize that honoring and respecting Mother Earth, Haki, is central to Lenape culture. Indigenous peoples continue to protect and honor all wisdom, past, present, and future, and will always do so. Indigenous peoples have and continue to experience genocide, theft of their ancestral lands, and other atrocities connected to colonization. It is necessary to honor these beginnings, history, and realities. It is essential to honor the ongoing legacies Indigenous cultures nurture within our communities and the lands that we gather, live, learn, and work on. It is necessary to acknowledge that Indigenous communities are still here and continue to act against harm and work for the collective healing and sustainability of humanity and the earth. So if we can take one more deep breath in. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing for now, and you're going to hear me for another 5 minutes, and then I'll hand it over to the panel, because next I am presenting a poem that I wrote for Asian American History or Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I also intertwined it with Mental Health Awareness Month. May is both of these 2 things. And as an Asian American woman and as someone who has struggled with mental health, both of these months are very, very important to me and something that I intertwined with my writing. So I think I knew I was gonna be too nervous to present it live. So I recorded myself right before this saying the poem, still a little nervous, but I will share my screen with you all so you can hear it. And then we'll get into the panel. Okay, let's see. Sharing the screen, sharing sound. Can everyone see this? Beautiful. Okay, there's me, and enjoy. At first, we covered our mouths indulged in your oriental dreams, listened to Christianity, and traded commodities when no one thought this is how it'd be. Then, we were forced to come to your land, lend you a helping hand, build bridges and rails while you told us we'll never fail, so no one thought this is how it'd be. Now, I cover my face, my eyes, a disgrace, once Miss Model Minority, now yellow disease. Get away from me. Can someone please explain how history came to be America's greatest mystery, a catastrophe of minority misery, white man fragility, and falsely claimed colonies? I didn't think this is how it'd be. But as I sit in this world that wasn't made for me, I realize I was not born on a blank canvas, not free but in a frame of mind, drawn with yellow skin, small eyes, dark hair, thin bones, upon my smooth baby skin, all over my third grade grin, as I was playing in the schoolyard, getting bullied and marred, trying to paint myself bold, bright, and brilliant with colors like one in a million. But they chipped and scarred my identity, my heart, so I knew from the start I never belonged. They told me to stay strong, but I wanted to be gone. 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 Away from this nightmare, an American dream, turned from black and white to a colored TV, but instead of vibrant diversity, it's still a war of you versus me, subtitles in English only. I always knew we'd lose our minds to the beating of our consciousness, but never our lives to the beating of your monstrous, unprovoked, and physical harassment assault. And somehow this is still our fault. When our personalities were given on a platter, expectations are all that matter. Exceed to succeed, work hard for some peace. Mentality is all you need, but close your mouth. Hide your face. We'll tell you when you're the superior race. I used to sit and wait for someone to tell me to speak, to be proud of my identity. But from Yuri Kochiyama to Linda Sarsour, I finally accepted my reflection, my power. As a Korean American, first generation, English speaking woman, born in the States, New York raised, my soul set ablaze, I can no longer sit and wait. So I ask you this question from Kathy Park Hong. Who are we when we become better than them in a system that destroyed us? Who are we when we become better than them in a system that destroyed us? Who am I when I finally get to paint myself when others are still being molded through the system? Who are you when you finally transcend history, standards, and the suffering of our ancestors when our brothers and sisters in different regions, governments, and societies are still in the fight? They told us this cannot be, finally standing in unity, but no more you versus me, us versus them. Aren't we looking for a final end? Our skins intertwined, yet we've been fighting this whole time. Please just look me in the eyes, because I'm done trying to hide behind my culture, behind my fear, the words that held me back for years and told me that I've never belonged here. Happy Mental Health Awareness Month and Asian American and Pacific Islander Month. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was me. Thank you so much. And that is all for the beginning. We're going to move on to our panel. I'm going to spotlight Diana, Ryan, Wayne, Vanessa, and Elda. And Diana will be our moderator today for the panel, so I'll let you take it on here.
All right, sorry, just getting to the unmute button. Selena, thank you as always for your raw honesty. It is always super appreciated. And I think you ended it with exactly what we're trying to do is, right? How do we create communities where people feel like they belong? And how do we have the honest conversations that need to be had so that we can create those communities? So thank you for that, Selena. And sunlight is kicking in now. So I'm going to try to block it out. I'm going to introduce the panel and introduce myself for folks who don't know who I am. I'm Diana Noriega. I'm the Assistant Executive Director of Anti-Racism and Equity at Good Shepherd Services, New York City. This is like Michelle said, one of many things that we do to really help support our staff and really help kind of keep the conversation going. I'll jump right into our panel because I think they're amazing and you all are really going to get a lot of hearing from them directly. We're going to form this as a conversation. So we'll pose a question and there might be dialogue exchange between the panelists, but we really want this to be fluid and dynamic. Please drop any questions that might come up or pop up in your head in the chat directly to Selena. It's tempting to put it in the larger group chat, but what happens is it moves really fast. So it becomes hard to follow. So if you send it directly to Selena, we'll kind of help keep track of the questions that way. So we'll have the conversation and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. Cool? And you can also feel free to use your reaction buttons. Let's just say you feel inspired by something somebody said, put a comment in the chat or do a thumbs up or do an applause on your toolbar. Put a heart if you feel like that really touched you in a personal way. Really, the reason we use meeting and not webinar for this is because we do want it to be an interactive space where folks can engage with one another. All right, so I'm gonna look and see how many of you, is that okay, thumbs up? All right, and again, remember, you don't have to use your camera. You can actually use the reactions on your toolbar if you don't feel comfortable on camera. We are recording this. We will be posting it after today. Okay, so I'll start with Elda. So Elda is an associate professor in the English department at St. John's University. Her research interests are Asian American literature, Asian American studies, whiteness, and literary form. Then I'll move on and I'm going to even do brief intros because again, I want them to really get into dialogue. Vanessa actually joined the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families as co-executive director in April 2017. She's really been a fierce education advocate in New York City, really kind of advocating on behalf of Asian American and Pacific Islander students and English language learners in New York City public schools. She was also appointed to the panel for educational policy, which leads education policy across New York City by Mayor de Blasio, and has been the chair of PEP since 2014. I'll move on to Wayne. Wayne is currently the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council, the nation's largest Asian American social service agency. CPC works with over 60,000 community members in the areas of education, family support, and community and economic empowerment at 35 locations throughout New York City. And then I'll move on to Ryan. Ryan was born in Kuwait to refugee parents. He was raised in the Philippines. He's currently the CEO and co-founder of Next Day Better, a media company that tells immigrant stories to make the invisible visible and empower change. And again, you'll hear more from each of them about the respective work that they're doing in their communities, but wanted to give a really quick, brief bio. And actually, before we jump into the panel discussion, I'm going to pass it on to Elda to really kind of do an introduction and share a bit of historical analysis so that we can put this conversation into proper context.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Diana. So I'll just plunge right in because I'm afraid that it will be too difficult to condense all of Asian American history into just 20 minutes. I tried this before and it turned out to be 24 minutes and 32 seconds. So I'll just talk about the sort of big points and then I'll move into the smaller, the more individual segments. So overall, in introducing the sort of backdrop to anti-Asian violence, which is this entire history of this discourse called Orientalism. What I'll also try and do is to connect anti-Asian violence to anti-Blackness. There are several sort of actual institutions and mechanisms that do that. And that's connected to the model minority myth, which itself is also connected to this much larger backdrop of American empire. And then finally, I'll end with talking about African and Afro-Asian solidarities. And so as a way of intro, I thought that, you know, in the popular media, we get the impression that anti-Blackness in the Asian American community, that anti-Asianness in, you know, communities of color are a sort of natural
sort of tension. And we see that in the news media a lot, especially in the way in which what has been sort of prioritized have been the muggings of Asian Americans by Black folks or by folks of color, when in reality, research shows that most of the perpetrators are actually white. It's only 5% that are African American. So this is this kind of trope of this anti-Blackness, anti-Asian violence that is in fact not natural. It's anchored in white supremacy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so this is why it's so important to dispute it, because it also serves as a smoke screen for what's actually happening, right? What the actual foundation is. And what I mean by white supremacy, I'm not just talking about sort of, the white nationalists, but this idea of whiteness as a kind of human norm, right? Whiteness as a kind of property that should be protected in law, protected and sort of given advantage to in institutions like bank lending, in education, in residential patterns. And this notion that whiteness is the kind of default American, is the default citizen, right? That those are the connections that are made. And we'll see in the law that these are constructed, right? They go all the way back, and it's tied to sort of one of the very early laws that have something to do with Asian Americans. But really the most important part about talking about whiteness is that it's whiteness. So this is not white people, right? So it's whiteness as in a much larger idea with a history, with a set of beliefs, with practices and laws and institutions behind it. It's whiteness that defines what anti-Blackness or what Blackness or what Asianness is. It's whiteness that sets the categories, that sets the terms of debate, which is why I want to sort of ask us to maybe take on a different paradigm instead of thinking about that as just anti-Asian, anti-Blackness as a sort of tension, which is real, right? I'm not disputing that it's real, but to place it in a much larger context to understand its origins and its context and how it comes to be. So I'm going to be giving you a lot of information. And in part, I think this is information that we're not given access to. And I just want to sort of pause a bit and really just sort of amplify Selena's poem, which was not only really powerful, but also full of knowledge, right? So there's so much knowledge embedded in that poem, and it's some of that knowledge that I'm going to try and unpack for us. And it's hopefully now the recognition of this missing information that we didn't have before that will help shift some of our paradigms and our sentiments. So the first thing is the notion of Orientalism or the Oriental, and I created a little PowerPoint, but I am very technologically incompetent, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm not one of those Asians. So let's see. So you see what my classes are like. All right. So can everyone see the screen? Yeah. All right. So this is a much longer presentation, so I won't necessarily go over everything in the slide. But Orientalism, I said, was a set of beliefs, but for one of the scholars who is the kind of founding scholar of this idea, Orientalism is the European representation of the Orient, or the Western representation of the Orient. And by talking about representation, we're focusing on the fact that Orientalism is not about actual people or actual places. It's a construction. Right? And it's a construction with a certain purpose. So if you see here in this quote from Robert Lee, who's an Asian American scholar who wrote a book called Orientals, he says, Oriental defines Oriental in racial opposition to whiteness, right? That's why it's so important, that what it also helps to do is to create and construct what whiteness is by defining it as everything that the Oriental is not. Only the racialized Oriental is yellow, Asians are not. And there he's making a differentiation, talking about the difference between Asians, actual people who may not even think of themselves as Asian, because that category too is constructed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this focusing on racialized is yellow. That is, this is a constructed category. This is a racial category that's been made, that's been backed up in popular culture, but also in law. And this notion of it's being defined in opposition to whiteness, I'll talk about some of the major characteristics of what has defined the Oriental or the Orient. And these are ideas that we can trace all the way back to classical antiquity, right? We have we see this in, for example, Hippocrates talking about, Asia and the East in a particular way. So some of these characteristics may already be familiar to you. So one of them, for example, is the notion of the yellow peril, that Asia is a threat to Western civilization. And we see that now in the language about China, but also the language about COVID, right? And COVID also has another sort of aspect in which the Asian body is seen as disease-ridden, as a pollutant, right? And then there are a couple of other aspects, the notion of the Asian American as coolie, right? As mechanical labor. They're here to take our jobs and they'll do it better and cheaper. Or there's also the notion of the Asian as a spy, as a gook, right? And I'm thinking about, for example, Dr. Wen-Ho Lee, the nuclear scientist who was put in solitary confinement for doing precisely the same thing that his white superiors did, but they were not punished for it. And finally, it's the notion of the model minority, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the supposedly the good immigrants, right? These are the good Asians who prove that there's no racism in the US and that America deserves to be the global hegemon as the spreader of sort of democracy and capitalism. So all of these sort of characteristics and focus around the idea of Asians as foreign, as alien, and as other. Right. And here you'll see I've given you some dates. So back in the early 1900s, when the flu pandemic, the plague pandemic came about, Chinatown was, of course, treated differently. You had, in fact, white public officials saying that, this is an Asian disease. White people don't get this disease because we're much cleaner. I didn't give you that quote. But just to look at this quote from Erica Lee, who's a historian. By stigmatizing Asians for their purportedly diseased bodies, filthy living conditions, hyperfertility, immoral habits, white nativists cast them as social inferiors and use these arguments to push for racial segregation, right? So the idea then that these are characteristics that are just naturally part of Asians as their culture, not that they're actually characteristics that are constructed that have certain kind of bases in certain kinds of laws and certain kinds of like residential zoning, for instance. All right, so this notion that Asians are foreign, Asians are alien then, are tied also to what you see here with COVID, right? So if you remember, Cuomo talked about how most of the COVID virus in New York comes from Europeans. Why aren't there mass attacks on Europeans? Right? Why are the attacks tied to Asians? So it's this notion already sort of emanating from this idea that Asians are alien, that they don't belong here, that they're not really part of the community, and that therefore they have to be suspicious. So I'll just show this other slide very briefly just to show you that there's a much longer history of anti-Asian violence. It isn't just what's happening today. So you'll see down here in this little box that I've given several examples of early Chinese workers and Filipinos being lynched, being hunted down. And so this emerges throughout history, right? But the important point, and here I just want to cite a quote from another Asian American ethnic studies scholar, Dylan Rodriguez, who helps direct our attention away from the individual, which is often how racism is talked about, and towards systems, right? Towards these much larger historical patterns that persist today. So he says the individualization of anti-Asian violence distorts its institutional, cultural, and systemic dimensions, while ignoring its complex historical relation to chattel slavery, anti-Blackness, colonialism, imperial war, heteronormativity, white supremacist patriarchy, and racial capitalism. So that's a lot of fancy jargony words, but you can see how essentially he's saying that this anti-Asian violence then therefore is connected to all of these other interlocking systems of exploitation and of oppression. And our task then is to trace those connections so that we don't see this violence as simply an exception or simply this one person who's filled with hate or who has, however they describe the Georgia shooter, he had a bad day. right? The most recent sort of event of anti-Asian violence that really galvanized the Asian American community is in 1982, the killing of Vincent Chin. And so Vincent Chin was a young Chinese American man. He was a worker in Detroit. He was going out for his bachelor's party, and he was hunted down and killed by these two white men who accused him of taking their jobs. They thought he was Japanese. And so these white folks were never really punished. They had to do some 1,000 hours of community service, and they were levied I think a $3,000, $4,000 fine. And so this became a moment in which all of these folks that have been compelled to fall under this umbrella of Asian, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, recognize that there is one sort of solidarity. It's not that they are Asian, but that they share the same categorization as Asian, therefore subjecting them to a particular type of violence. And I think the other panelists will talk more about how that category of Asian American is so heterogeneous, how it's always threatening to fall apart because of class differences, immigration differences. So I'll just sort of like pause there and not say more than that. But I'll just, in the next slide, I want to talk a bit about how the category of Asian gets constructed and gets made. And so this then is tied back to my point about how whiteness or white supremacy is this kind of undisclosed anchor point. So Asian Americans were part of these two really important Supreme Court acts in the early 1900s, in which they demanded the right to naturalize, to become citizens, because they said they were white. And the reason why they had to claim whiteness in order to demand the right to citizenship is because of these naturalization laws that have been part of American history since 1790. So this is the very first act, the Naturalization Act of 1790. It restricted citizenship to those who were free white persons. And essentially, it kind of meant you had to also be male and property owning, right? Women weren't property owners, so they also couldn't naturalize. But this title that I've framed of making the alien, it's this notion that Asians aren't naturally alien, but it's a constructed category that's made to serve a certain kind of narrative, right? And to advance certain kinds of economic and global purposes. So in 1870, that law was amended. After the Civil War, African Americans were added. And it wasn't until 1952 that the racial restriction to citizenship was lifted. So this is relatively recent, right? Either within some of our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our parents. And so the two Supreme Court cases, if you'll look at the right-hand corner of the screen, was Baggett-Tind in 1923 and Ozawa in 1922. Just really quickly, so there were over, I think, some 40 odd cases of Asians or Mexicans or Filipinos or Arabs arguing that they were not Asian, but they were in fact white. And most of those cases were struck down with the exception of Arabs and Syrians. So these two cases then are just the kind of tip of the iceberg of a much longer history. But just really quickly, just to show you how malleable the definition of whiteness is. So in Ozawa, which was passed down in 1922, they determined that he could not be, he was not eligible for citizenship because he was not white. So Ozawa had claimed, my skin is very white. He cited all these anthropological authorities and they said, your skin might be white, but you're not Caucasian, so you should not have the right to naturalize. Well, the very next year, actually just a few months later, Baggett-Tind case came up to the Supreme Court in which he argued that because he was Caucasian and ethnologically, according to all these anthropologists, South Asians are considered Aryan or Caucasian, he therefore deserved the right to naturalize. The Supreme Court reversed. It was the same Supreme Court justice reversed the ruling and said, well, actually, in fact, you might be Caucasian, but you're not actually white. And how we define white is what the common man on the street thinks. So this is the kind of like historical backdrop and the information that's sort of missing from what we see today, the sort of very narrowly myopically focused, it's just this group against that group. So I think now maybe I'll move to the to the model minority and give a bit of that history just based on that. So you've seen this sort of legislative history, right? And it's really relatively recent that that was lifted. So the model minority myth, and I'm calling it a myth, in part because it was made, it's constructed, it is intrinsically tied to anti-Blackness, but it is also tied to American empire, the idea of America as a superpower, as a global superpower that deserves the mantle of world leadership. So the model minority is an idea that was first coined by a sociologist in the 1960s. And there were several news articles about it, but I've given you a quote from probably the most famous news article, and you can see how the anti-Blackness is embedded there. So from this news article, at a time when it is being proposed that hundreds of billions be spent to uplift Negroes and other minorities. So this is in 1966 at the height of the civil rights movement, right? The nation's 300,000 Chinese Americans are moving ahead on their own with no help from anyone else, right? And there you see the kind of beginning of these stereotypes, right? That Asians are hardworking, which is why they, can prove that there is no racism in the US, whereas African Americans and other minorities are lazy, right? They're waiting for handouts. And this was a way to really derail the profound and powerful argument of the civil rights movement, which is this is a systemic pattern of targeting discrimination against these particular people that's embedded in our institutions, right? So the model minority myth becomes then an alibi for the US to deny that there is this pattern of systemic racism. But also the important point about the model minority and how it's tied to US empire is, I want to direct your attention to this quote. This is again, Robert Lee from his book Orientals. So this is also at the height of the Cold War, right? So the US is in the space race and the arms race against, the dangerous menace of red communism. So Lee explains that the notion of the model minority sent a message to the third world, especially to Asia, where the US was engaged in increasingly fierce struggles with nationalist and communist insurgencies, that the US was a liberal democratic state where people of color could enjoy equal rights and upward mobility. On the home front, it sent a message to Negroes and other minorities that accommodation would be rewarded while militancy would be contained or crushed. And we can see that now in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Where you have these peaceful protesters, but the response to them is absolutely out of proportion in comparison, for example, to the white insurgents who tried to take over our Capitol on January 6th. So this notion then of that model minority is tied to anti-Blackness, but also that it's tied to American empire. And the reason why I say that, and I'm just going to move to the next screen, is if you look here at this quote, this is from another Asian American scholar, Jody Kim. She says, much of the contemporary post-1965 Asian American population has been formed as a result of US Cold War interventions in Asia. And so that's not only important in terms of why the model minority becomes so important as a kind of propaganda globally, but also to focus on the fact that these Asians, and this is particularly where we situate the model minority, right? The post-1965 immigration of Asians, these people were hyper selected. That is, as part of the arms race and the space race, the US designated the selection of Asians who were already overly educated compared to those of their peers in their home country. So they were selecting technological workers, right? Professionals, engineers, scientists, to help them in this space and arms race. So this is the reason why you've already selected a population that has already experienced success in their home countries. And the myth then comes about that, oh, it's because they're just naturally, somehow they share these cultural values that allow them to succeed. So I think I'm going to just stop there in terms of the empire and just very, very quickly talk about a couple of historical instances of Afro-Asian solidarity that we don't get to hear about. And one of the most well-known was in 1955. What was known as the Bandung Conference. So this was a meeting of 29 newly liberated African and Asian countries that got together to try and come up with a third way, right? So not the first world of advanced capitalism, not the second world of communism, but this third way of international cooperation. And I just want to give you a quote from the Sukarno, who is the president of Indonesia, who hosted this meeting. He said, you know, we have different histories and different backgrounds, but what we share in common is two things: the common detestation of colonialism in whatever form it appears, and the common detestation of racialism in whatever form it appears. Right? So it's these two things that actually link the history of Asian Americans to the history of African Americans. And there are relatively contemporary echoes of the Bandung Conference in, for example, the Third World Liberation Front, which was student groups made up of Black, Asian American, Latinx, Chicanx back then, Native American students who agitated for curriculum and classes that sort of address knowledges that they could bring back to their communities, right? And there are many other examples, and I think Selena mentioned one of them with Yuri Kochiyama, who was an Japanese American activist who was very active with Malcolm X. Like in that sort of iconic picture, she's the one who's sort of like cradling his head in that picture. And so there are these, and there are also these engagements in terms of music, in terms of literature, which I won't talk about, but just to say that, to ask the question then, why is it so important for that other narrative to be so prevalent? The idea of anti-Blackness and anti-Asianness kind of as a sort of natural tension describing the relationship between these communities, right? What does that obscure? So I've talked a lot, so I'm gonna stop here. If you have questions, we can talk about them later. But I'll end that there. So I'll stop sharing screen. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm not sharing screen anymore, right? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to mute myself.
Very good. So we want to just kind of go around again. We'll have like a conversation. Thank you, Elda, so much for that rich history. And again, even though you cannot summarize all history in 20 minutes, you did a really good job of providing, I think, a foundational context, right, for kind of the current state of affairs that we're in today. And I want to pass it on to all the panelists. And could you share, and I know Elda actually talked about this a little, how do you personally, racially, and ethnically identify, and 3 words that describe the most important elements of your identity? And anyone can take the lead.
I hit unmute first, so I'll go. So I do identify as Asian American, as particular Chinese American, and specifically Cantonese speaking. But I do identify myself as a woman, a mother, and a New Yorker. Someone else supposed to go?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invite to be here. Wayne Ho, he, him pronouns. I identify as Chinese American and Asian American. And as this conversation goes on, I think we'll tease out ethnic versus racial identity. A couple of words to describe me. Father, Californian, and I also went to UC Berkeley like Elda did, so go Bears. That's 2 words, but it's important to me, so go Bears.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan from Next Day Better, and I am Filipino American, immigrant, new American, hip hop enthusiast, and proud new dad.
Thank you. And again, we had folks. Oh, Elda, yes, you did. I forget because you just.
No, I just
ahead.
have 3 short words: Asian American scholar. I'm done.
I love it. So we thought it was important to have folks kind of get a sense of who people are beyond, right, their ethnic or racial identity as well. And so we'll just jump right into it. Could you, I mean, we're in a particular moment in time, and there has been a heightened increase, right, of anti-Asian hate in the United States. So how have you and your families been managing during this time? And not everyone has to answer. So whoever wants to take that.
I will share that I will probably say that I've still lived a very sheltered, like, because I am not really still kind of quarantining in many ways, just also because I think work has been so busy, but consciously always thinking about my father, who's turning 90 on Friday, that he, he likes to go out. And so he does, like, he did move in with us a year ago, but he likes to go out to, check on his things and to, stop by Chinatown, pick up groceries. So there's this always constant level of just managing the anxiety or the fear of like what, and making sure that we know he's safe. He likes to, get on public transportation and be very independent still. But I would love to be that lucky, but I think it is one of those things where it's constantly in the back of my mind.
Yeah, I could also answer to that. Vanessa, I didn't want to cut you off.
I'm done.
Okay. All right. I was like, oh, we're so polite. I just Diana would be like, oh, you could point who could go. But yeah, I think for me, I think about Black joy. And I just had a baby at the course of this. And I think about, if there's Black joy, there has to be Asian joy. And I didn't want what was happening with Stop Asian Hate or racism to steal joy from me. And so it was a daily practice in making sure that racism takes lives, racism takes time. As a person of color in America that's an immigrant, I spend a lot of my time and my essence in thinking about how do we move towards equity. But I was like, there is no way racism is going to take away from me being happy to see this brand new baby in my hands. And so it was tough because I was, I could be angry, I could be saddened by all these things, but I've really taken it to reframe and maybe just a rejuvenated call to action of, here's a moment in human history. We're creating actively a post-COVID-19 world. And how do I, not selfishly and leveraging my baby, but think about like, what is my renewed sense of call to action? So yeah, do not let racism steal joy.
I love it. And so we'll move on to the next question, because I think it also kind of connects to this moment. And this is again for whoever wants to take the question. Could someone talk about your personal experiences with racial bias? What is the one thing that has been really challenging to let go of?
So I'm an immigrant. I was born in another country, and my family moved to California when I was less than a year old. And there's a side of me that thinks that all of us do social justice work because something happened to us when we were kids. And for me, it was going to kindergarten, not speaking English, wearing fobby clothes, having a bowl haircut, 4 weeks after going to kindergarten, getting glasses, being the only Asian kid in my kindergarten class. And it was I grew up in San Jose, California. At that time, it was a pretty white neighborhood that I was in. So being the only non-white kid in my kindergarten class. But what I recall though was that being taken out of class to go to ESL programs. And even after I learned English and started being whatever the higher reading levels and achievement levels, which is a longer conversation we get into educational equity. I just remember going from, there's no unified school district in California, or in San Jose. So I remember going from my elementary school district to my middle school district. I got tested again for my English ability. And when I looked around the room, everyone around me were Latino, Latinx, or Asian, all Asian backgrounds. So Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, Indian. And then I remember going from middle school to high school after I was already at the higher level of everything in middle school. And again, I got tested for English ability, and everyone around me is brown and Asian. And I think at that point, so when we talk about racial bias, it's not whether or not someone has said something to me. I mean, it's part of it. People said things to me at the beginning of the pandemic on Canal Street. People did throw things at me. I remember someone at Barclays Center when we were shut down and I was heading to work. Someone went up to me and shoved me against a wall and screamed in my face. But it's not those incidents that really get to me as much as systematically our school system, our housing system, where I could live, my kids can live, my classmates can live, like the type of instruction I was getting. And why is it that an ESL kid who was in ESL for a couple of years will inherently be tested in multiple points along a school system? And that's on the good side of education, but I was doing well in public school. So what happens for those kids, the Black and brown and Asian and immigrant kids or LGBTQ kids who are not doing well in school, and what systems are in place to block them? And I think that's the bias that I've always carried, is why is it that even when I was 5 years old, I was othered, which I think is what a lot of Asian Americans feel, is being othered.
Thank you for sharing that, Wayne. And I think the part where you said so many of us who do social justice work, it's coming from this in many ways, like our narratives that were built through childhood. And I would say for me, that resonates. And does anyone else want to take this question on? If not, we can move to the next.
If I had a cool haircut, I would be in like corporations and working at Goldman Sachs, but I had a bowl haircut. So now I'm stuck here working in nonprofit.
Not stuck.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, I could take this one as well. You know, in terms of my immigration story and my own bias. You know, when I first came to America in 1994, I felt like my mom lied to me. She's like, "Oh, you're coming to America, and it's the American dream," and I was like, "Where are the white people?" Because we immigrated to the Bronx, and so already from that point on, you know, Saved by the Bell was the show that was being shown in the Philippines. So I was like, where are the white picket fence? Where are the white people? And I'm here in the Bronx. And then, you know, as I went from elementary school to junior high school to high school in the Bronx, I also was saying the N-word often and didn't understand the gravity of that. And so I think for me, it's a constant conversation and journey, everyday journey of unlearning racism and anti-Black sentiments and understanding my responsibility as an immigrant to go through that unlearning journey. But then on the other side, and the flip side, I think about, you know, the racism that I've experienced towards like my particular family. I've had an instance in the Bronx. This is from another Afro-Latino immigrant who told my mother to go home, go back to your country. I was like, whoa, you're an immigrant too, so that doesn't really make sense. How's this happening? But it was like also just this aspect of like, well, if you really see my mother, you will know that she was a registered nurse at the largest public hospital in New York City and saved thousands of lives and counting. And do you really see her? So this contrast is, I think, a question of invisibility. Do we really see each other? That's something that I kind of think about when I start to judge versus me being curious about seeing other people. And so, yeah.
Thank you for sharing so honestly, Ryan. And I think you're talking about the tensions of white supremacy, right? And how it pivots us very often against each other and doesn't allow us the space to humanize one another. What does it mean to see people for all of who they are and not just what we perceive them to be based on stereotypes that we've been fed truthfully through mainstream media, largely. Vanessa, I saw you had your mic on and I just wanted to check in to see if you wanted to say, okay. So, and actually, Vanessa, this next question is for you. And I think Elda also spoke about this, right? The Asian community is not a monolithic or homogenous community, right? Similar to any community, there are many kind of identities that exist within that larger construct. And you oversee a membership organization that represents several Asian American communities across New York City. From the work of your organization, what Asian communities often get left out of the dialogue? And what are the range of needs in the various communities that you work with and represent and how do they differ and where they're similar?
Mhm. So CACF, the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, founded in 1986. We are founded as a Pan-Asian policy advocacy organization and really a coalition. So to this day, we're really intentional about bringing the diverse Asian American community together, united to fight for equity for those most marginalized Asian American New Yorkers. So we are bringing, community organizations who serve the South Asian, the Southeast Asian, the East Asian, and we've included, African Americans, Arab Americans, and Middle Eastern communities in many of our campaigns and work. So it is hard work, to like really bring the diversity of that community together and ensure that they have the support and to really be advocates. And we believe that it's actually really important that we do this collectively, that we have that power in numbers. We always talk about that we don't need just a few shining stars for our community fighting, that we actually need to be building a constellation of folks that are fighting for equity. And I think, because, I think I'll just talk about, because the Chinese community has the longest history here in New York City and still really the largest portion of the Asian American community here, the Chinese community experience tends to dominate the narrative. So when we talk about the larger invisibility of Asian Americans, the experience of, the Vietnamese, Cambodian, Bangladeshi communities in the Bronx, or the Nepali, Filipino, Guyanese communities in Queens, Pakistani community, American community in Brooklyn, and the Sri Lankan community in Staten Island, like those are often unknown to many. And I think oftentimes when, folks, I will say government sometimes will say we check the box of engagement with the Asian American community when we've talked to, I won't say CPC, but they are the largest. So, I think the sense is that we that work is done. But, emphasizing that the Asian American community is not a monolith, our history and experience are so vast. I mean, even within the Chinese American community, like that experience is, like my immigration history, my family's immigration history here is different. We have recent immigrants, from the Fujian community to like third, fourth generation of Toisanese. So I think that actually gets lost as well. But I think at the end, it's also the struggles of our low-income workers, people who are working multiple low wage jobs, or struggling with language access and limited English proficiency. So at the end, it's around like the question is who is doing the erasing, and for what purpose or what reasons. And I think we talk about the how our community has suffered by the impact of certain stereotypes, like the model minority myth, like the perpetual foreigner. And so how this kind of systemic racism and I think kind of the white supremacy culture really renders those the struggles of our communities invisible. And so when we talk about fighting for our community and our visibility, denouncing those kind of problematic stereotypes, we also have to acknowledge that this is part of the fight against anti-Blackness. And I will also add that like where we're also fighting this, we're also trying to fight the systemic erasure of those struggles when our government does not collect disaggregated data. So, disaggregated by Asian ethnic group, by language, because that data is used to inform policy. It's used to inform a community response. So if our government does not really understand those pockets of needs within our diverse Asian American community, our government will fail to actually meet those needs. And actually what ends up is that our families lose out.
Yeah, in our need to categorize and kind of put communities together, we leave the big picture out. Vanessa, that's such a valid point. And that advocacy piece, right? Like, what does it mean to really disaggregate data and not clump people together and assume that their story is streamlined? You're not capturing the nuances. So thank you for elevating that. And there might be some government folks on the phone or who watch this later. And so hopefully you hear that message that Vanessa is sharing with you, and also help us advocate, as that is also a piece of racial justice work, is are we disaggregating data and using it to put in meaningful interventions and practices. So I want to thank you, Vanessa, for answering that. And this is a question for the group. What is one fact that would surprise people about the Asian American community? And anyone can take this question. I open it to the group.
Okay, I guess I can share a fact, even though I feel like I've talked a lot, but this is sort of one of the historical reasons why, you know, Asian Americans and African Americans, but also like Pacific Islanders have this link. So we all know about Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, right? So Booker T. Washington himself was trained at a place called Hampton Institute. I think it's Hampton Normal and Industrial School. And that was a vocational training for African Americans. The person who founded that school, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, was a son of missionaries. And he had followed his parents to Hawaii, where they had employed the exact same techniques of racial uplift and manual training. So you see that this long sort of, and then what's also kind of connected is for Native Americans, it's the Carlisle boarding school. Richard Pratt, I think, also learned from Hampton. And so you see the ways in which these communities are connected together, but the connecting thread is the white civilizing mission, right? That you need to learn how to be independent, to be self-determined, to be self-ruling, and we're going to teach you that, right? We're going to teach you the habits of democracy, which is what they told Japanese Americans when they put them in internment camps. So there are these histories to uncover that show, in fact, that there are opportunities for coalition building, right? But we don't know about that.
Thank you, Elda, for elevating that. I think that that's an interesting fact too. And I think even when you think about folks who were pro abolition of slavery, they were trying to actually, right, inundate Black folks who were freed to say, this is the way you need to behave. This is how you have to be socialized, acceptable according to white terms, so that you could be seen as we made the right decision, essentially, right, for moving you and freeing you. So yeah, thank you. That's a powerful story to uplift. All right, Wayne. So can you talk about the work that your agency does, and what are some of the challenges or issues that you are finding are coming up with the communities that you work with?
So CPC, Chinese American Planning Council, we were founded in 1965. So we started out as a Chinatown Planning Council, and it happened at the intersection of immigration reform, civil rights movement, and the end of the war on poverty. So since then, we've grown to have 35 locations in 3 boroughs, so Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. And we're now the largest Asian American social services nonprofit in the country. We only focus on New York, though. So we serve 60,000 New Yorkers per year. Of the 60,000 New Yorkers that we serve, 2/3 are Asian American, mostly Chinese. The other third represents the diversity of New York, so Black, Brown, other immigrant, BIPOC, and low-income communities. So we're part of the settlement house movement, so we're part of United Neighborhood Houses. So we do serve everything from kids to seniors. But I think, like all of us during this time who are essential workers, we've done what we've had to do on mostly government contracts and our services, where when folks were told to stay home in March 2020, the vast majority of my staff were still out in the community, feeding folks, educating folks, delivering meals, providing home care, providing affordable housing, supporting the developmentally disabled. So I would say, as a human services organization, which obviously Good Shepherd Services and others that I see in the participants here mostly are, we've had our own staff put their health on the line to serve others whose health was also on the line during a very challenging time. The only thing I would add, that as from an Asian American perspective, a Chinese American perspective, is that we've had to ramp up a lot of our services at a time when we have elders and families who live in the most overcrowded housing in New York City, folks not having access to tablets or the internet, folks who were suffering from violence and being scared of going outside their homes, to having the highest rate of linguistic isolation. So no one over the age of 16, Vanessa, help me out, 16 in the household speaks English well. And I'm sure it's a lot of stuff that everybody knows, which is how do you do remote learning when you don't have internet access and when you don't understand English? How are you getting access to public benefits? The unemployment benefits that were expanded from the state, they did not have hotlines that had language access. No one was speaking Chinese on those hotlines. If you went to the government websites to do vaccine enrollments, they told you to go use a Google plugin in order to translate it into Chinese. And that's never accurate. And also, just because you speak Chinese, a Chinese dialect, Cantonese, Mandarin, Fujianese, it doesn't mean you can read Chinese. So we were getting phone calls from folks, and we've never done enrollment into unemployment or how to deal with eviction moratoriums. But we were getting phone calls from our community members. They were reaching us through WeChat. WeChat is kind of like the Chinese Twitter. They were reaching out to us on these channels to get help on how to deal with unemployment, how to enroll in food programs, how to not be kicked out of their homes during this time. And that's stuff that honestly my staff weren't fully trained for either. So I think that we struggled not only with the human services angle that I think all of us struggled with at a time when city, state, and federal governments were cutting contracts, and all of us are, trying to get funding restored and enhanced for our services, while at the same time trying to keep our staff safe and being told we have to give PPE and other things. And the state government would tell us, you're on your own though. There's no supply chain to get masks or anything else. And then trying to serve our community members who consistently are left behind and don't have things in their language, in their culture, or might not be accessible to immigrants. And I think, having said all that, I think that's honestly the reason why organizations like CPC exist and the member agencies of CACF exist, is because other human services agencies are not the ones that necessarily have the deepest reach in the communities and have folks who understand the language, the dialect, the culture, the ethnicity that's being served. And it's not just our expertise in service delivery, but it's also our knowledge and roots for generations in a community, which I think becomes very important, especially in these deep times of distress and crisis.
Thank you, Wayne. Really, really helpful. And I'm gonna pivot a little to kind of talk about, and I think we've been hinting at it, and Elda spoke about it, and Ryan, you spoke about it, right? Media and the power of story, essentially to shape narratives. And so what role has the media play and continues to play in the stereotyping of the Asian American community? And feel free to share some examples or stories that you want to uplift.
Yeah, this is actually a recent one. I was watching a romantic comedy where I saw there was chemistry between an Asian American man and a Latina person. And at the end, I was like, I hope they better kiss. They better kiss. And they did not. And so this is a movie, I think it was a 2008 movie. And so I'm sharing this as part joke, but part real, because for the longest time, there is a generation of Asian American men who have not seen themselves in a leading role, who have not kissed a significant other or found love. And if you think about the effects on the psyche of what it means to be an Asian American male, it's like it questions and influences, am I worthy of love? At the deepest core of humanity, I know it's just a kiss, right? But if that's not mainstream media, like where can we see possibilities of ourselves, right? And so that's, I think, one of the the robberies of lacking of media representation is that it's taking away possibilities, not just for Asian American men, but for Asian Americans or for those who feel underrepresented in mainstream media.
Thank you for Elevate. Does anyone else want to? That's a great example. The power of like just seeing, this is the power of representation is what you're talking about, and how important it is to see yourself reflected in other spaces to help create even the dream. Can I even explore that or do that? And I think about it too. Like when I was younger, Claire Huxtable was like my TV role model, legit. And had Claire Huxtable not existed, right, here was this really powerful woman of color. I don't know that I would have been able to create that possibility, right? To say, because I didn't see it anywhere else on TV. And I know plenty of people who saw Claire Huxtable in that way. So yeah, I agree, Ryan. Thank you for uplifting that. And I even think about dating apps as you're saying that, right? Like what has been the experience? I think I read somewhere that Asian American men, right, are not as popular. And I see Elda and Vanessa nodding their heads on dating apps. Elda, do you want to add something? I don't know the stat, but I know I read this somewhere.
Yeah, this was, I think, a 2014 OkCupid survey in which Asian men and Black women were the least attractive. But you also see this in, for example, intermarriage rates, right? So what Ryan's talking about with the Asian male body as emasculated, that's another sort of aspect of Orientalism in which Asian bodies are seen as sexually deviant or sexually perverse. There's something wrong with them. The men are passive, the women are too hypersexual. That you see these ideas and they filter out into who you find attractive, right? And I've been reading a lot of these sociologists who've been interviewing Asian white couples and Asian men with white women or white men with Asian women. And many of these couples want to say, well, it's just love. We're just people. But she's trying to uncover, but there are these much larger discourses that grant a certain value that shape your desires that you may not necessarily be aware of. And I think that's where it's kind of directly tied to what Ryan's talking about with the kind of representations that you get to see and therefore stoke your imagination.
That's so powerful. And Elda, I think about what you're saying in the context of the Latino community and whitening la raza, right? Like whitening the race and saying I'm attracted to this person, right? But really what's underneath that attraction is there some implicit bias or understanding that whiteness is better? And so am I implicitly kind of attracting that to kind of genetically, right? Like reshape, and I see it in my family, right? That there was racial mixing that happened. So really, really powerful to uplift that. And to your point, Elda, earlier point that look at the themes, right? How there are so many kind of connected stories that we often don't talk about or elevate that are so powerful. So I'm going to move on to another question unless someone else wants to answer this. Okay. So Ryan, I'm going to direct this to you because your company is very intentionally trying to reframe the story. And really, I think that's also really powerful is creating counter narratives to the dominant white narrative, right? So I would love, what has been the most powerful, if you could share, the most powerful story that you have created from the Asian American community? You're on mute, Ryan. This is Zoom.
Oh, it's this is not an apology, but there's a baby, my baby is crying in the background. So I've learned not to apologize for that. And right, just to provide a little bit of context about how Next Day Better works as a media company agency, we design and tell inclusive stories to solve a community problem. So we want to hone in on what is the problem and how do we use stories to address and bring value to the lives of the communities that we want to serve. So we've done stuff with Asian American, API, BIPOC communities, but in particular with the Asian American community, I'll hone in on two community problems that I felt like was really powerful. One is with Asian American veterans. There, from a policy perspective and from a budgetary perspective, for decision makers, there is a clear hesitancy to fund culturally competent programs to help Asian Americans with PTSD. And part of the behavioral psychology that we are learning was that they think Asian American veterans are a recent phenomenon. That is incorrect. Asian Americans have been serving in the US military since the birth of the nation. That is the fact. We have fought in the Civil War. During World War II, over 250,000 Filipino have fought during World War II and helped win the Pacific Theater. The highest decorated military regiment are Japanese Americans, and folks do not know about this. So we created an animated story that is about 6 minutes long, detailing the history of Asian Americans in military history. And now this is being shown in veterans VA offices across the country. And so we want to change hearts and narratives in saying we are Americans in this way. The second story that I think is really critical is that there is a teacher shortage in rural America. Guess who are filling them? Filipinos under a J-1 visa. So if you go to the town of Shelby, Montana, and we went there, they are having difficulties recruiting American-born teachers, and they are having to outsource, quote unquote, and recruit. And unfortunately, since they are under a J-1 visa, they have to be turned over every 3 years. That's not good for the teachers, and that's not good for rural America. So this story is about immigrant rights. It is about the education system and how Asian Americans and Asian immigrants are filling the much needed gap to serve our Americans with dignity. So we are helping to shine light on these issues and sharing that we are here, we are Americans, and we are contributing. And the story is not about being defensive. The story is just bringing humanity to the lives that to Asian Americans and the lives that we affect. So those are two examples of the stories that we've told.
Super powerful. Could you, not to be partial, could you drop the links in the chat just so folks can watch it? Because I think, I didn't know that about the shortage of teachers. That's really powerful. And sure. I think the more we can share these stories, the more we can amplify them across our networks and even in our lives, right? And further humanize folks.
And we worked with community organizations across the country that cannot afford this type of marketing or storytelling. So we intentionally work with community organizations who are doing the deep groundwork, but need visibility about the miracles that you guys are creating, like Wayne and Vanessa. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for uplifting that. I can't wait to watch them. So Vanessa, I'm going to come back to you. And so many folks might know or might not know, Vanessa has been a part of the New York City School Diversity Committee, as well as part of, and so was Wayne, and so was I, the three of us. One of the ways we know each other. But took on the mission of desegregating New York City public schools. And some folks might not know New York City public schools were the most segregated schools in the country. One of the most diverse cities, right, in the world, has one of the most segregated school systems. You have been a fierce advocate, Vanessa, and I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about what backlash have you received for supporting these efforts, even from within your communities, and what do you think of that backlash? And also on the flip of that, what support have you received? And I think this speaks to some of the narratives that get at the divide and conquer.
Mm-hmm. So I am, I guess, the official boogeyman in the Asian American community fighting for integration of our schools. And when we're talking about integration, we're not just talking about moving bodies, we're talking about resources, we're talking about representation. And so I will say that I have been personally attacked and named a traitor to my own community. A small handful of folks came out to the CACF gala, passing out chocolate gold coins with my name on leaflets saying that I sold out my community. So all of that, I think, is to try to scare me to not speak that truth, right? To not stand and allow, my sense was I cannot allow them to continue to use the Asian American community as a wedge to ensure that, or to maintain the current status quo. Like, I will not stand for that. I feel that these folks have, within the Asian American community, have pushed a narrative of fear to our immigrant communities, to our low income Asian communities, that the sense that they will be losing out on whatever opportunities if we were to integrate schools or support diversity and equity initiatives, or even support culturally responsive, sustaining education, or even, and I will say this, invest in programs that have been working, like community schools. So these were the same narratives, and I've had to, in all of that, to say that this should not be seen as anti-Asian. This should not be seen as our community losing out on opportunities. That we, it was clearly the sense that oftentimes what we see in the narrative around educational equity is the opportunity gap between the whites and Asian students and the Black and Latinx students, when in fact, if I go back to what I said before, we don't have the disaggregated data to actually really understand where our kids are struggling within the community. And so this was we cannot uphold the model minority myth, and we cannot uphold our community to be used as a wedge. And have, this part of what that narrative became, was that they will stand against, changing what are clearly ingrained policies that are not supporting and benefiting the most marginalized in our public school system. I cannot stand when we have folks within the community have young students talk about, I worked so hard that I deserve this education, that it's not fair if I lose out on something because someone else is just lazy. So those are things that we've had to, I felt really compelled to make sure that we need to pose a different narrative of what the Asian American community was like. We're not a monolith in kind of where we're thinking on these issues as well. But media wanted to kind of uphold that. I wanted to make sure that we would be pushing forward the value of creating really diverse learning environments for our students, that they have, that actually have various perspectives and abilities, that really lends itself to our young people being able to develop critical thinking skills and other skills that will lend itself to, to reaching their full potential. I wanted to make sure that we're creating an opportunity for folks to not live in fear, but actually be able to think about the possibilities of what we can do to transform our schools when we center those kids who are most marginalized with this. I think as policymakers, we need to create policies grounded in kind of those perspectives of youth voices and those who are most marginalized. Because it was almost a sense that our Asian American students are not in, but they are in overcrowded and under-resourced schools. They are English language learners that are struggling. They are students who are not graduating on time. There are students with disabilities. There are students who are really struggling with poverty and language barriers. And so we it's not that we can, my sense was actually telling those students that you don't have to believe that there's this only one path to success, and that good schools are not defined simply by test scores, and that students themselves are not to only be defined by their test scores, and that they actually bring all their gifts to schools, and they should be, celebrated. So I think I've found my energy by continuing to uphold those, to sharing and sharing with young people and our families that there are these other possibilities of supporting our youth holistically, that really encourage their kind of continued curiosity of learning and that pursuit of knowledge, and that they can, realizing that they really can't grow without being uncomfortable, without being stretched, without failing. And I think that like having that space with allies in this work, like you, Daya, like Wayne, like others who are, parent leaders and young people and advocates who are also kind of, some of that learning about unlearning some things about the Asian American community and how do we call our communities into these discussions. Because at the end of the day, like it is, fear is what has prevented a lot of folks from embracing what's possible. And so how do we address and acknowledge that fear, but create that space for folks to really think about what do we really want? And in particular, as a parent, I will always say, like, any parent will want what's best for their kid, but what's best should be defined by really knowing what your kid, what gifts and what their potential can be, and what environment would really provide the best opportunity to reach that full potential. And it's not defined by what's best by listing out like the top 10 schools that US World News and Report says are the best 10 schools, because that might not be the best for your kid. And so that's this idea of, really making sure that we could support our young people, really focus on our most marginalized, and really create a system that does not see public schools purely as a commodity that we need to compete for. And that's like when we compete, those are the good ones. But that we can move away from that scarcity model, but really kind of embrace what schools, public schools, are supposed to be here for all of our kids, for the public good.
Thank you for sharing that story, because I think it's a great example of solidarity. Ella, do you want to add anything? Please.
Oh, no, not to add, but just to ask Vanessa to maybe talk a bit more. Vanessa, you mentioned the policies that sort of keep the marginalized students that way. Could you just maybe say a bit more about those?
Yeah. I think what we've seen, for example, recently, middle school screens. So middle school screens, by use of like test scores and other kind of measures that kind of truly kind of pull out kids and dub them as like, these are, because we lived through a pandemic and we can't expect our kids to go through those things, those screens were lifted. And now we see access to schools. So what we've seen, like, for example, and I will say, like, gifted and talented, and how New York City does gifted and talented. When we test 4-year-olds for a single test, we're tracking kids into particular programs that at the end of the day aren't providing, the district schools especially aren't providing experience. And I will say, like, district schools, if the gifted and talented is providing experiential and project-based learning, I don't know why that's not available to all of our kids. When, gifted and talented is providing an art class versus their general, like, why is that given to all of our kids? Special trips or whatever, those things don't seem like, those things, like, many of our kids don't have access to those. The gifted and talented program, for example, there's like 2,000 plus seats every year that are offered. We could be providing that kind of programming and experience to more of our kids, and all of our kids actually, and still provide opportunities for those kids who may need to be, differentiated learning to provide accelerated opportunities or, spaces to learn. But I think the idea is that there is so much value for our young people to be in spaces where they are surrounded in diversity, in schools that reflect our city.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we had talked about, Elda, even with this in the diversity committee, was testing a 4-year-old is not even a valid form of assessing a young person's talent. At 4 years old, it's not even the appropriate age. So you have young kids who are showing up to this test who are super nervous and who are like, I'm in a new environment. I'm 4 years old. Like developmentally, it's just not appropriate. And yet New York City does it.
And I
Yeah.
will just add that in our immigrant communities, they are sold that this is that path. So they are given, like, if your child's 2, you better start paying for test prep. So they'll be prepared to take that test because, and we can reimagine a system that doesn't make families have to feel forced to make these kind of really difficult decisions around putting their kid in test prep at 3.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the response of let's create more GNT seats when you have a system that serves 1 million students is not the response, because that's only 2,000 students, but you're going to create 1,000 more or 500 more versus a system of 1 million. So it's just not pragmatically also going to get at really enhancing the education for all students. But Vanessa, I really like to uplift that story because I think it speaks to solidarity. And that entire process and the work that we did together was really one of solidarity. And how did we stand together and not let anyone really divide us and conquer the narrative? We had a very clear mission and focus. And I want to, and Elda spoke about this too, the lineage, the history of Black solidarity with the Asian community in the United States. And so I want to give anyone else who has the opportunity, could you talk more about an Asian American civil rights leader or a story where solidarity kind of happened between the Black community and the Asian American community, or a leader that inspires you that kind of amplified that? And Ryan, I know you wanted to share something before.
I guess I can. I really give it up to, the civil rights leader with no Twitter followers, the aunties and the uncles who have put in the work, who doesn't know how to navigate as much the state and federal funding and philanthropy systems, and yet with so little have done so much. And so I think about folks like Raj Chaudhary out of Minnesota, who is pivotal at the time of the pandemic to feeding Indian Americans, elders, during the pandemic, culturally competent meals that felt like home, who are facing social isolation. And at the height of the George Floyd protest, helped and opened her doors and her community to the protesters in that particular city. And so she is an auntie with minimal, I don't even think she has Twitter. And there are many of them out there, Asian Americans, who are just doing the work because they know it's right, even though they don't have the state, federal, and philanthropic arms supporting them. So that's one story, and there are so many more.
Someone wrote in the chat, Grace Lee Boggs, I know you also spoke earlier, Elda, about the relationship between Malcolm X and Yuri. But Grace Lee Boggs is also someone that doesn't get uplifted enough. And I think about her work around liberation organizing and how she has written so profoundly and beautifully about that work, about how to bring communities into the practice of organizing. So I'm a fan of Grace Leaf Boggs as well, Amy. Thank you for uplifting that in the chat. How do we dismantle, and this is probably a big question, how do we dismantle anti-Blackness and anti-Asian hate? What is the path forward towards deeper and authentic solidarity? And anyone who wants to take the lead on that. I see some thinking faces at least. Like,
I'll take a crack at this. I think, and this is unorthodox, and this is what I've learned for helping people tell their stories, especially folks that feel underrepresented or feel invisible, is that there's so much pain in our storytelling. And an entry point is that there's a shared experience and history of invisibility, of pain and trauma. And if you open the pathways for vulnerability, being able to talk about what pains each other. And I think when I think, and I said this earlier, pain is because we don't see each other in our full humanity. And I think about the LA riots, and I think about Black and Koreans and Asians pitted against one another. I see African Americans and Black small business owners that were denied business loans, and that pained them. I see Asian American immigrants who are serving communities who just want to be helped, who are bullied and target of violence. And I don't think there's enough conversation around pain as a way to true healing. And so it's uncomfortable, it's tough, but I think that's a part of the healing process that our communities have to undergo.
Does anyone else want to, thank you, Ryan, for being so vulnerable and honest. And I definitely think conversation is one route to starting to further humanize people. And I'm a fan of the intergroup dialogue model. And for folks who don't know that, that is when you have folks who represent different groups in the same space where they can have authentic conversation, right, about whatever they're experiencing in relationship to themselves and to each other. And it's I've seen it be a really powerful model for how to break open vulnerability in a way that's helpful and productive. I see the chat kind of also going on fire, but want to also see if anyone else wants to take that question on what are some strategies or ways that we can start to dismantle anti-Blackness and anti-Asian hate. And Vanessa, I'm looking at you. You might not be able to tell, but I know you started a group. You started doing some anti-racist organizing work as well and having conversations. So that's why I'm looking at you.
Yeah, got it. I couldn't tell that was happening. I think it has always been part of CACS work is, realizing that we particularly Asian American community here in New York City, we're a highly immigrant community. So having that language and having that hasn't been available to our immigrant families. It's not being taught in our schools to kind of really gain a level of racial literacy. So I think there is this sense of often, on top of that, living in really sometimes segregated bubbles that we, folks not realizing the trauma that our community is facing, but also the trauma we may have caused. And so creating that space. So we do that with our young people. We do that with our staff at our member organizations to really understand who they are as Asian Americans, but also understand how they connect those struggles across. And now we're actually piloting with someone also who I met through the School Diversity Advisory Group, a parent leader, Shino Tanakawa, a real parent group to really help create that space for unpacking some of the things, and unlearning some of the things we may not have realized we've learned. So it is kind of the sense of creating that safe space to look and explore things that we may not have had that opportunity to really understand. So understanding what the model minority myth is in relation to anti-Blackness, understanding the myth of the meritocracy and what that has meant for a lot of our families, but the impact on other communities. So I think that is part of like creating those spaces for those dialogues, and really just hard conversations, because people don't, it's not something folks are comfortable to talk about. And so how do we create those safe spaces for that to happen? And how do we identify those folks who want to start exploring those things with us?
Thank you for elevating that, Vanessa. And I think that's important work. So that's why I wanted you to talk a little bit about it. And Donita wrote in the chat, also like experiencing joy is a way to kind of build solidarity across communities. And absolutely, I think of the Audre Lorde quote, right? Even about self-care, which to me connects to joy, is a radical political act. So we're almost going to get to questions. So if you have, please send your questions to Selena if you have any questions. But I want to ask 2 more questions, and if we can, folks can keep it like concise. What are your top 3 advocacy issues that you want to elevate for Asian American communities? So that way you can engage this audience and how can we show up, and support the movement?
Vanessa should go first on this one.
I will pick like I will pick these kind of cross-cutting things. So of course, I think data desegregation is really important. I think looking at language justice, particularly within the diversity of our languages of the Asian American speech, those that are low density, low incident languages, because we see then what those barriers will mean for communities in terms of even if we just look at COVID, the information and the failure to navigate how to get the test now, how to get a vaccine, and those challenges that many of our community organizations have had to be stressed to do that. And then a third is just really overall, how, the lack of cultural responsive systems, the importance of why we think it is much more efficient to have and invest in organizations that have the trust of the community, that are from the community, those are important. And I'm seeing that. I think a lot of it is how do we then also move to these actions together, so that it's not just, I feel like in looking at real solidarity and work, this has to not be just out of convenience, and it's not these issues can be connected across communities, and how we do that together. That it's not, these aren't transactional relationships that we have, but how do we strengthen that work across?
There was one I thought you would say V that you didn't, so I'll take it.
Okay.
So for me, the 3, I would say first one is budget justice. So Asian Americans make up 15% of New York City, 10% of New York State, and we get about 1%, 1.4% of social service contract dollars. In the city, we get less than 2% of all philanthropic dollars. there's been some minor shifts due to the rise in anti-Asian violence or perceived rise in anti-Asian violence. But systemically, the budget's a moral document, and they continue to balance it on the back of the lowest income New Yorkers. And it's not about rejiggering the pie, because to be clear, women-led, LGBTQ-led, immigrant-led, Black and Brown-led organizations also don't get a fair share of human services dollars or philanthropic dollars. So I think it's all about us trying to widen the pie and expand the pie and get more resources there. So budget justice is one. Two is just representation at the decision-making table. We don't have the elected official. I'm from California, right? Like, everyone from city council to county board of supervisors to all the way up to state representatives and folks who are in their state capital. We have more API representation, and not just all Chinese and from the same neighborhoods. We're talking about diverse Asian American representation. And even if it hurts me, some of those are conservative voices and Republican voices at the table, but they have that in California. So I think that we need to be at the decision-making table and not just have folks who happen to be commissioners of agencies or have a quote unquote liaison from the community affairs unit who randomly shows up to our galas, but someone who's really making decisions and understanding what's happening on the ground with the community, and then having policies and programs and practices that reflect that, and resources that reflect that. Vanessa and I were 2 of 4 Asian Americans on the school diversity advisory group. And we get a call on Saturday morning at 11 a.m. saying that the mayor is going to announce changes to the specialized high school admissions test at 1 o'clock and wants us to show up and support it. Like, we can't do that, even if we believe in changing the specialized high school admissions test. You cannot tell us 2 hours beforehand when it's our community who's going to be angry and up in arms, and Vanessa and I can't show up and keep them in check when you give us a heads up on it. The last one for me is economic justice. Too many times Asian American businesses are left out of MWBE contracting and goals at the city and state level. In workforce development programs were left out. Small business services, the small business loans that have happened are left out. When they came up with the Lower Manhattan recovery plan around COVID to target certain neighborhoods, they left out, so Chinatown in Manhattan is covered by 3 zip codes. They left out one of the zip codes because it crosses over to Tribeca. So just inclusion on all these efforts. We have the most overcrowded housing. According to the mayor's office, we have the highest rate of poverty. And just not including Asian Americans in economic justice efforts is a problem. And that's once again how we continue to be invisible in a lot of these issues.
I'll be quick with 2. One, buy tickets of Asian American movies and films. It's not that we lack Asian American creators or filmmakers. It is because studios don't think that there is a market for it. So watch and pay for and rent Minari, Yellow Rose, Asian American made films, because if you're talking about chicken and the egg, it is up us to vote with our dollars in supporting Asian American filmmakers and creators to change mainstream narratives, quote unquote. And then the second thing is to think about, and this is on my end, my struggle, is that for media representation is all anchored in marketing dollars. There is an economy of representation. And so I am fighting for Dorito dollars or ARP dollars or whatever dollars to say that we need to fuel more inclusive, intersectional, honest storytelling that not put a United Color Benetton ad or Asian American Black, but to really speak to the Asian American or BIPOC experience in America. And so that's my biggest challenge. And that is what is needed to shift the narrative in terms of mainstream media. So yeah.
Thank you. So some of the questions that we received were about the slides and some of the data points, which Elda has dropped into the chat generously. So if folks also use her PowerPoint deck, please give credit where credit is due. That is a racial justice concept. So we believe that we always want to recognize folks who put in the intellectual labor into their work. No, Elda, it's important. So give credit where credit is due. I think those are most of the questions. And then Selena also dropped in the chat that we will share the links coupled with the poem and all of the pieces so that you can have some materials of support to go back to your communities and have these conversations, including the recording for today's session. Thank you to the bulk of you who kind of stuck it out. There's one other question. Cross-race effect essentially says that people are able to identify and recognize people of their own race more than other races. If someone were to arrest or detain someone of the Asian or Black community wrongly, as their judgment is biased by their inability to recognize someone in that community, would those come under anti-Asian or anti-Blackness?
I think the professor wants to answer that one.
Could you just repeat the question, Diana? I'm a bit confused about what
Yeah, no, Wayne was sorry.
the problem is.
Yeah, I think I'm a little confused as well. So I think if someone were to arrest or detain someone of the Asian or Black community wrongly because their judgment is biased by their inability to recognize someone of that community, would those come under anti-Asian or anti-Blackness? And I probably, I'm assuming it's a bit of both depending on the perspective of the person, right? That's kind of how I hear it.
Yeah, and I guess I would also say that they're connected insofar as we see this sort of this pattern of violence, but they're also differentiated, right? So if we compare the anti-Asian violence that we're seeing now in the 21st century, right? So I'm not talking about 19th century, but for example, the shooter in Georgia, he was this individual in some sense, right? Whereas the violence against Black bodies, that's state sanctioned, right? That's a really different order of violence. So I'm not disputing that violence happens against Asians, but I think it's important also to differentiate the intensity, and because state sanctioned violence is very, very different from, individual violence. One you can maybe address with knowledge, the other you need to transform institutions, right? So I think it's different types of work. So that's not really an answer to that question. But I guess as a way of answering that question, I would say that anti-Asian violence and anti-Black violence does not depend on your intention, right? It does not depend on, I'm going to be biased or I don't see this. It's more this action that is measured by its effect. Does it harm this community that has been historically marginalized, right? Historically exploited? Does it repeat those historical patterns? And whether, and the real question of racism is, does it cause injury rather than what I intended? So I think that would be my roundabout answer to that question.
No, that's a great, and that was actually very, I think, a beautiful way to distinguish the two, right? One is individual versus state sanctioned. That's so powerful, because I think also there's sometimes an inclination to conflate when, and that's actually at the core of often anti-Blackness, right? And sometimes to me, at the core of this country, Black folks have been treated along with Native folks the worst. And it's not the oppression Olympics, but rather just naming that hard truth and saying, how do we understand that, acknowledge that, and make room for repairing that harm is so important in a racial justice context. So thank you, Elda, for like really elevating that. So we are, I don't think that there are any more questions, Selena, unless there are. You can tell me if there are.
There are not. There is just one statement I want to share from
Yeah,
Danita,
please.
and not necessarily a question, but it's fascinating and unsurprising that whiteness uses the same tools to ensure anti-Asian and anti-Black narratives. So thank you, Danita, for sharing that, because I think that was the point of this panel, or a lot of what we were trying to come across, that whiteness is very centered in our harm against both Black communities and Asian communities. So thank you for sharing that.
Before we close out, do we want to, Selena, do we want to do the breath, and then I'll jump into real quick the
Yes, let me replace the spotlight. Oh, with myself and you, Diana. Wow, my face is so big. Add the spotlight. So we talked a lot. Well, Vanessa, Eldo, Ryan, and Wayne talked a lot. If you guys can use your little emojis or clap for them, I would just like to say thank you so much for speaking. It's been an hour and a half almost, or maybe hour 15 of just beautiful, deep, riveting conversation and stories. So thank you. And a lot of things were shared. So we're gonna take a collective breath together in a moment of silence. So I'm gonna have everyone breathe in and then release.
So before folks head out, thank you, Selena. We do want to close out with the unity clap. And this is a way for us to elevate. And so Selena, can we do a gallery view of everyone's screen? This is also an invitation to turn on your cameras as we close out and we're in community with one another, right? To acknowledge people virtually and to create some form of intimacy and connection. Sometimes turning on the camera is really, really helpful. So we're gonna go to gallery view so we can see folks all together. And if you can, go to gallery view in your right-hand corner. And again, turn on your cameras and we're gonna do the unity clap together. And so for folks who don't know the history of the unity clap, Larry Itliong, who is a Filipino farm worker organizer, actually gets really underrated and does not get any shine. People often have heard of Cesar Chavez, and he often gets credited with leading the farm, the grape, right? The grape, I can't remember the actual name of it, but it was, thank you, Wayne. But Larry Itliong actually had started organizing Filipino farm workers before, and actually really had been leading a lot of those efforts in California. And he, again, often does not get enough credit for the work that he does. And so Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta approached Larry Itliong and they started to collaborate and to say, let's do this together. And that if we do this together, we're probably more powerful. And the product was, they were successful in their advocacy efforts because of that coalition building. And one of the ways that they would close out some of their organizing meetings, yes, they would do the unity clap and they would start off slow to the beat, right, of a heart. And they would do it in unison. That's why it's called the unity clap. And they would end it with one final clap. And Ryan, do you want to say that out loud? What they would say?
Isang bagsak.
Isang bagsak. So we want to do that right now together, really hard on Zoom, but it's a really powerful activity. And again, what I want you to do is to imagine that you're actually looking at someone in their eyes in this space and that you are honoring the fullness of that person. So turn on your cameras, make some eye contact, even if it's virtual, we're going to hold the space for that. And I'm going to ask you to turn on your mics and to do the unity clap together. And I'll start it. And it's okay if we're not in harmony, right? We're learning together too. And I'll start slow. Do it until everyone catches on. And then we're gonna go faster. And Ryan, close this out.
Isang bagsak.
Isang bagsak. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for learning with us and for being present for this conversation. Again, we have many conversations throughout the year. We'll probably be taking a break for the rest of 2021 in the spring, in the summer, and then we'll relaunch in the fall in September with some more stuff. But please turn on your mics also and say goodbye. Drop some love in the chat to the panelists. We believe in affirming.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
This is
for
great.
having-
It was so
Thank you so
amazing.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So much.
So,
Truly amazing and informative.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night,
Were you on a
everyone.
meeting? Mommy.